altitude and landing test out in Dryden with the Enterprise. And one that actually was built earlier turned out to be the Challenger, converted from STA 99 as a wing load test article to a real shuttle. Enterprise was never converted. Columbia actually rolled out first. Columbia was the one that I saw the least of, because I saw most of mine after 1992, and I did see a couple launches with Columbia. It's markedly different than the other ones. First of all, it's much heavier. The bricks and everything were much heavier than the thermal blankets they had used on the later shuttles. And so you can always tell Columbia has a little triangle on the leading wings, and it's a black triangle. And also, shortly after they built it, on the top of the tail, you can always see a little bulb, looks like a little projection sticking out from the top of the front of the tail. And that's what makes Columbia so much different than the other ones. Challenger, Atlantis were pretty much carbon copies of each other. There were a lot of updates when they built Endeavour, basically out of spare parts from the program, on the cheap, to replace Challenger after it was lost. Now, everybody knows I wasn't really a big fan of the space shuttle after the 1986 Challenger disaster. I thought back then if they would have started with what they have now with United Launch Alliance and SLS program, we probably would have been on the moon a long time ago. But that's even Mars. That's neither here nor there. It is what it is. I'm glad the Ares program got canceled. I'm hoping they can get SLS to fly. I actually like that one a lot better. Even though they use the same camera angles all the time on the long-range trackers at the Kennedy Space Center, and also at the landing site, both at Kennedy and Edwards, it looks on TV like a lot of these launches are all the same, but they're really not. I've been to 38 of them myself, and every one of them looks different. The ones that go to like where the Hubble orbit is, launched on a southeasterly track out of Kennedy on a 28.5 degree inclination, and that kind of takes it like this way, not really on the equator, but not really polar either. It's, you know, about it lines up with where Kennedy Space Center is at 28.5 degrees, and so that's the most common natural place to launch out of Kennedy for the shuttle. It takes a lot more fuel, and you can carry a lot less mass if you go into the polar orbit at 51.6 degrees where the station is. And I also see on some of these flights, even before the station was built, that they had also gone in that same orbit. I don't know why, but I did see that a couple times, so it's one of the things I'm going to ask Coot Gibson about, because one of his launches before the station went up was up on that orbit. The good thing about that orbit is you can see much more of the Earth from that perspective, and you have 2 chances a day to launch to meet the shuttle in a launch window. Normally it's just once a day, actually, in the ascending node takeoff, because they never took off to the southeast. I guess they could have, but they didn't. I know that there's a couple of countries. I know Japan's one, and I think Wallops here in America is another one, where they can hit that 51.6 heading on a descending node, which means heading down to the south on launch instead of up to the north. But when it went up to the north, you could see that thing at night go all the way up the eastern seaboard as it climbed to orbit. Mr. Walker is a 3-time shuttle astronaut, really a nice guy. Here's my hero of heroes, Vance Brand. Vance not only flew the Apollo, opening the doors for what's known now as the International Space Station and the International Partnership, but he also commanded 3 different shuttle missions. And it's really fun to listen to him talk about the difference between flying the shuttle with a rocket on top of you versus a very powerful Saturn that's all under you. And it's very fun to watch him talk about the changes over the years in avionics for the shuttle program itself, plus the differences between the Apollo program and the shuttle. Now, Jack is the guy who made a one-time only landing on the White Sands runway in New Mexico. And the only time it was ever done, as a matter of fact, they almost flipped the thing when they landed, but it was really an awesome landing. And as you can see, he was also a veteran of Skylab 2, which was very interesting because that's the one that had to repair the heat shield damage from the first launch.
Yeah, I think it'd be better to do it.
And this is Mr. Fred Hayes. He's most famous for having the guts to actually pop off of a 747 in a powerless space shuttle. And if you've ever seen the movie Apollo 13, he was not in the movie. He was the movie. Apollo 13 was the basis of the Ron Howard film, and we are very glad to have him back.
In this whole area, I've had to re-record all the audio on this, but this was a wonderful view of a guy who I had the last interview with, believe it or not, before he had a stroke and later died. That's Scott Carpenter, Mercury 7. I think this is back from 2013, if I remember right. Spacefest 5. I just didn't take a lot of film at 4. I took a lot of pictures, but I corrected that for 5 and did a really wonderful special.
Well, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Let's come in the camera. Well, unlike last time, this is really packed up this time. So we have Fred Hayes, who I've told you before is very famous from flying Enterprise off the top of the 747, 905, I believe it was. And Captain Jim Lovell. You guys ought to get up here today because this is much better than having Tom Hanks and Mr. Bacon here. Believe me, this is the real thing. We are very privileged to have Captain Lovell here. I met him a couple times at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola. He came to the museum with the Mercury astronauts. We had Gordo, Cooper, Glenn, and Schirra there for that one. And that was, I'm telling them about the time you came to Pensacola when I was in the Navy, and you had the Mercury astronauts there. No, we're talking about when you came to the Pensacola Naval Air Station. And we had Schirra, Glenn, Cooper, and Gordo there, and you dropped by and stole the show. I don't know if you remember the Eastman Press series you did, but I still have it and I still watch it. The video series you did with Eastman Press, I still watch it all the time. Thank you. It's really great. Anyways, we have the pilot, very famous, most to me anyway, for popping off the top of a 747 in an unpowered glider that barely has wings, and that was the Enterprise. Yes, sir. I've been to Tucson, and that makes people crazy, though. And here we have Ron Guerin, Jerry Ross, whose daughter is now making spacesuits, Eileen Collins, a very good female mission commander. Hugh Gibson, actually, I think, was the first one off the Discovery after the Columbia was lost. I think he's the first one that flew that one up. And he became most famous to me for being a very outstanding airline pilot for Southwest Airlines. It was priceless. He's like, this guy's been at Tucson too long. And here we have Dee O'Hara. My favorite, Walter Cunningham from Apollo 7. He was the test pilot who I think, if you were here at Spacefest 5, Mr. Walter Cunningham was the one he went on a cruise after this, but I tried to give him a video. But if you've seen the pictures, my most proud moment of being here at 5 was to interview him for the first time. Just an outstanding individual.
When first popped off this 747-905 was because I'd skipped school that day. I think I was in grade school still in '77. I was in high school, but I did skip school and watch this on NBC. So this is very, very slow motion. This is one of the later flights actually with the tail cone off. We still have some issues with the footage, I think, with the first time I aired this, and YouTube banned it right away because some group out of France decided to file some kind of a copyright claim against NASA footage, which I had used with permission. So I'm still trying to get that sorted out with YouTube and have them do some due diligence. This is Enterprise coming in to the lake bed. Just as the lifting body and X-15, more of the lifting body had done in previous years. So the X-24B also was something that Joe Engle had flown, and I did forget to ask him all about that. But this was also a very exciting day and a very tough time for me in my life. But I do remember this as well. I think I was a senior in high school, and there goes the shuttle with very heavy paint around the external tank, and it was a very exciting time for us. And within a year, I was working in an office building in Lincoln Center in Denver, and remember all the wonderful pictures that one of the huge fans of the shuttle program had posted in her office. So it was very memorable. And the second flight, they had taken that white paint off and saved a lot of weight. And so you see the foam tank exposed for the first time, and they've since then redesigned the foam to the run of Columbia, I think, because they had to comply with some kind of a EPA requirement that made it very difficult to keep that thing together. General Joe Engle went up in tube, and once again, first 5 flights were all by Columbia. STS-3, I had a really good talk with Jack about a lot of this flight, and once again, he was on Skylab as well, and really did enjoy talking to him about both. He flew with Skylab 3. I said 2 earlier because I thought that's what the sign said. I think he was on 3 with Alan Bean. Maybe I have this turned around, but this was a wonderful, wonderful view of the shuttle launch. STS-3 had some weather issues in Kennedy and at Edwards. Couldn't land at Kennedy at anyway, so it had to make a bingo out to White Sands, Florida. White Sands, New Mexico. I stand corrected. And he was the only shuttle to ever land there. And what happened was there was a lot of wind gust, a headwind, but not a steady headwind. There was a lot of gust going on in White Sands that day. I think they were landing to the south. And inspiration for what later became that parachute system that came out of the tail was basically, Jack and I both agreed, because of this flight that hit that wind gust, it threw the nose up on landing, and just wasn't quite as bad as what happened to Enterprise on one of their flights when they came in with a really bad crosswind. But in this one here, you can see they get the main gear down, and the nose starts coming down, but then the gust comes in and pops in the air. And as a result of this flight, I don't know why he never flew again. He did run against a sitting senator, I think it was Carl Levin, and almost won. There was a lot of issues related to the fact that he and I both love Toyotas, so I guess that hurt him enough up in Michigan, where they actually built all those American cars, that he didn't win. But really a great guy. Just loved talking to really loved talking to this guy. And here's gear down for Columbia, White Sands. Obviously a lot more sagebrush than you see out at Rogers. And the nose comes down, goes up, comes down, and that was the end of his shuttle flight, even though there was no pilot there involved. Just bad luck with the gust. But, good thing he didn't hit any sagebrush or anything like that and flip the thing that way. But it's a very interesting landing. And as a result, you start seeing parachutes come out of the back end of the shuttle to prevent that from happening in the future. And I'm trying to remember all these flights because, like I said, I've had to re-record all this. This is Columbia with Vance Brennan. This is his first shuttle launch, his second space flight. And if you happen to catch later parts of this series, I had a really great interview before, but I actually got this one on film. And he was very generous with his time and with his answers. And I learned some things I didn't know. Second viewing. First time we had talked a lot about his role in being a Lockheed test pilot for the plane I flew on in the Navy for 4 years, and that would be the EP-3. I actually told him about the A model that I used to fly on, PR-33, and that was a really interesting conversation because the A model was the one he was a test pilot for, and the Navy really bought a good plane with that one from Lockheed. And I really enjoyed the fact that he was the primary test pilot on that program. There's not a lot of differences in size or in interior mechanics between the shuttle and the Navy P-3, so he felt very comfortable aboard this, what later became a Boeing craft, I think Rockwell, North American Rockwell, I think. The same group responsible for the X-15, I think, was the one that had the first contract for the shuttle construction out in Palmdale. And here you can see the tape just gets much better later on, but you can see the long-range trackers from the ground watching the shuttle as it goes up. And what you don't really realize when you see it on TV is that plume from the boosters will go all the way back down to the ground, and you start seeing a lot of atmospheric effects on that plume at different altitudes. Vance Brennan would fly 2 other missions after this one as commander. One in the blue suits in this series, and the other one in the orange suits. And so he has some interesting stories to tell about experience aboard the shuttle. And he implied very emphatically that the biggest difference between the shuttle program and the Apollo, apart from the differences in the landing and approach and reentry, was in the fact that here's a wonderful runway landing. They finally put this thing down on runway 22 out in Edwards. I think it was the first runway landing. But the big difference between the shuttle program and the Apollo program, he told me, was really what happened up in orbit with the space available and that kind of thing. You're weightless in a very different environment on the shuttle than you were in the Apollo capsule, he said. Much roomier, I suppose. And here's Captain Paul Weitz, and I had another really great interview with him. This was the first flight of Challenger, so he really was in a much different aircraft. And he had a reunion at Spacefest with Colonel Bowe, and here you can see the wonderful launch of Challenger on its first flight. And he said this was also the first mission where they actually did a spacewalk up in space as part of the shuttle program. Another wonderful turn out to the 28.5 degree orbit, which is the natural one for the shuttle or any craft out of Kennedy. Uh, I think by this time they're starting to use Launchpad 39B, but I'm not sure. I really couldn't tell by that film. They're identical from the ground, separated by a couple miles, and the tail is always facing to the south when it launches, and it turns, in this case, to the southwest. And most of the shuttle program actually did take off on 28.5 degree, where you see it kind of hooked to the right. If you're looking from the west, and it made a much bigger flip when it went to the 51.6 on that roll maneuver. Very similar as far as ascent. In these days, they didn't have TDRS satellites up, so they didn't flip they didn't roll the craft right side up during launch. The pilots really enjoyed having that view of the horizon, which they lost once they did in later days flip the shuttle right side up during the ascent once they got up to 67 or so miles. And just a wonderful program, and that's kind of what you see from the ground from the Banana Causeway. I would assume that's probably taken from much closer. What you don't really understand is when that thing goes supersonic, it goes like a Star Trek swoosh, and then you hear nothing because it's going away faster than the speed of sound. And here's Charlie Walker on Challenger, and I was surprised when I interviewed him this year. He told me he was not a NASA astronaut. He was actually an outside contractor, kind of like the teacher lost on a later flight was also an outsider brought in as a contractor, not as a NASA employee. I found that very interesting. And in Amy's interview, he did say that he worked on pharmaceuticals and that kind of thing for industry, and was a paying passenger. I'm sure he didn't pay, but his company put out a lot of money to get him aboard. And this was one of the first night landings, and we're coming in. You can see this is all thermal imaging, so you can see that the nose and the front of the wings are still pretty hot after that 3,000 degree burn up during the roll maneuvers coming in. And gear down, and it goes into the lights. They can see the runway. This is before the microwave landing system got really good, so it was all manual approach by the pilot using some aids, DME, that kind of thing. And here they are landing on what's probably runway 4 out at Edwards. Might be Kennedy, but I doubt it. I'm pretty sure this was going to be runway 4 at Edwards. Could be 22. I don't know. I'm seeing a lot of dust. Maybe it's 17. I'm sure anybody can get on Wikipedia and do a better job with the statistics of where it landed. But it's interesting to see the APUs at night, because a lot of reporters thought the thing was on fire. It's not. It's just basically putting out a lot of exhaust from the APUs. And Vance Brand goes up on his second flight. This is his third space mission, second in command of a shuttle. And he had Captain Hoot Gibson with him on this flight of Challenger. And I think this was Hoot's first of many, many flights. I think he had 5 in total. And also Captain Bruce McCandless, United States Navy. I think this is the famous one where he went out there as the smallest spacecraft ever, and I had a really good talk with him at Spacefest about that. We got that in one of the later editions. Just a beautiful view of Kennedy. Like I said, I can't tell if it's 39A or 39B, but I guarantee it's one of the two. And we have ignition, and about 10 seconds later, the solids will boost. The solid rocket boosters will light. No shutting those off, and explosive bolts are fired, and the shuttle is on its way. They actually hold it on the ground for about 10 seconds while they fire and test the 3 main engines. And if all looks well, the auto sequence start will allow the shuttle to take off at T0. There she goes. Another wonderful roll maneuver. And this one does look like it's going up to the 51.6, believe it or not. There's current Senator Nelson. He did, I think, one flight, 28 days. I'm getting that confused, but he did a lot less than the NASA administrator, Charlie Bolden, who was a general who he always chided. So I always thought that was humorous. But this was a very political mission. They had Jake Garn aboard, a senator from Utah, who was on the SciTech committee, and it wasn't the first time that politics were involved in crew assignment, and it certainly wasn't the last. And there's Rob McNair, who would later be lost on a very quick or very soon flight after this. But everybody talked nothing but great things about Ron McNair and what a great sense of humor he had. Somehow into Aikido or the martial arts, but really a great guy. So they did a lot of, like I said, these are all in the days before they had the Teedra satellites up there. And one of the accomplishments of the shuttle program was actually that the shuttle had launched these tracking and data relay satellites into geosynchronous orbit, which allowed them to communicate and send video down in much better ways than they did before. And I think I've told this story before, but back in my early days, we did a lot of support in the Navy for the shuttle program. I was out on the Midway one time, and one of these guys got bored and called us up on a clear freak, and we couldn't believe it. But it really was them. And we were about the only thing in range at the time, as they were flying over the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, one of the two. There was Hoot. I didn't know last year he was actually married to Dr. Ray Seddon, and I certainly was much more aware of that this year, because they spend all their time together and they disappeared together. So that's what the married life will do between two astronauts. And there was actually a married couple that went into space. I'll talk about later on a different mission with Hoot. That's the one he flew with Charlie Bolden, and they actually had the first married couple up there. There's Robert Brand and Ron McNair. Keep him busy up there on the middeck. Like I said, over time, this thing just seems so huge compared to the Apollo even. The volume inside that the crew cabin of the shuttle it wasn't anything compared to Skylab, and they didn't do showers like they did on Skylab on the shuttle design, but they had other ways of trying to keep clean. And there is Captain McCandless getting ready for his famous spacewalk. He actually went up on quite a lot of flights, but history will most remember that he went out there on a tether, or without a tether, free floating. And he had told Amy he went about more than a football field away from the shuttle when he went out there. Really gutsy. And I never could figure out what the other guy was doing out there, because I guess he had a lasso or something. He could throw it at McCandless if Captain McCandless started having an out of control thruster or something. But that wasn't the case. But you can see the much larger MMU, the man maneuvering unit, going out from to a full football field out away from Challenger. And they take off for the night, but within 90 minutes they'll do a full circle of the Earth. So it's about 45 minutes of night, followed by 45 minutes of day. And what you don't know about this, and I didn't know this when I first recorded it, was at nighttime, it gets very, very cold up there without the sun. The sun will get you about 250 degrees Fahrenheit on the sunny side, but the backside is always going to be very cold, like 148 below zero. And they didn't have a heating system in this thing. They had a cooling system, like they did with the Apollo moonwalkers. And the only problem with that, from what I hear, is that it just seemed to get really cold for him up there in that thing. So I think being cold was probably his biggest worry or concern. That he wasn't worried at all. He told Amy about losing the shuttle. He said they had good contingency plans to use their RCS to get him back in case that thing had an out of control thruster. But yeah, that's more than a football field away. He's the world's model spaceman right there. A record, as I told him, that will take some time to beat. Even smaller than Mercury. He's a free-floating spaceman right there in his own spacecraft. But yeah, he didn't have any concerns. He just said it was just kind of cold up there because the didn't have any heaters, just had a cooling system, and it worked too well. Really gutsy, though, I'll tell you. I don't know if I'd be able to do that or not. Excuse me, guys. All right. And I guess they're testing out an early version of the Canada's robot arm. Not really sure what he's doing up there, but no, he kind of. I don't even think it's installed yet. It may have been, but he's out there doing something in the payload bay. We're not really sure what. Like I said, maybe just he's the lasso man. Yeah, there is the arm. So that one was installed by then. A lot of things you take for granted in the later part of the shuttle program, including good downlinks for video, just didn't happen back then. This was all old-fashioned film, and nobody saw this until they got on the ground. But there he is out there in the payload bay, a little bit closer to home, just doing some maneuvering. He's still separated from the Challenger itself, so he's out there just two spacecraft traveling at 17,000 miles an hour in convoy. He always tried to keep the shuttle in sight. He told Amy he didn't really have a lot of time for stargazing or appreciating even the Earth. He focused most of his attention back on the shuttle when he was out there. So you can always see him pretty much almost always facing it, one way or the other. There's a very interesting mission. I don't think they've ever put anything like this back up in space again. It was a test, and the test was successful. And as you can see here, he was able to operate tools and all sorts of things up there. And what you don't realize is that when you do operate tools that have torque to them, you don't have anything to anchor yourself up there except for opposing thrust, I suppose. So if you start like operating a drill, it'll start to twist you around too, without anything grounding you. So this mission is complete. They are closing the payload bay doors, and takes at some point, not very long thereafter, they will fire the OMS pods to slow the craft down. And amazingly, they only slow it down a couple hundred miles an hour, but that's enough. And a good half an hour later, they'll fall far enough to actually hit 174,000 feet, which is about where the atmosphere is estimated to begin, and they'll start to experience gravity again, and over time they'll be 50,000 feet at a little bit under Mach 1 over the hack, and they'll come in. And this is actually a landing at Kennedy Space Center, as you can tell, and maybe one of the first ones, if not the first one. And it looks like they're approaching runway 15, or that looks more like 33. I'll be able to tell you in later pictures. Looks like 33. Yeah, it is. So they're coming in from almost due north. They're making an approach, a dive bomb actually, to a point well short of the runway. And at a certain altitude, they'll flare the nose up. You can see those lights that they're approaching that's actually short of the runway. Then they're going to flare up, and this is before the good heads-up display days and before the microwave landing system really got really good. So this was all done by the pilot and his stick, and it's just amazing. With no chance to turn around, these guys were always able to put it right down on the runway threshold. A lot of that's engineering and GPU programming, but a lot of it's also just pure pilot skill. Yeah, that'll be runway 15 at Kennedy. So the goal in landing at Kennedy was to put these things into orbiter processor facility, buildings that were attached just northwest of the vehicle assembly building. Just all they are is just fancy name for hangars, and they would process the vehicles at Kennedy without having to put it on a 747 and get it back here from Edwards after landing. But I'll talk a lot more about that later, about sometimes they just made foolish decisions. They knew they were going to take it back to Palmdale for maintenance or rebuilding, but they landed it here anyway. Then they had to fly it back out to California, which made no sense to me if they could just land it at Edwards. But there's Vance Brand coming back from his mission with Hoot, and Ron McNair, number 4 there, and behind him is Captain Bruce McCandless. They actually developed some ceremonies. They had a guy come out there and paint on the runway where the nose wheel had landed or stopped, I guess. But I think alligators were the biggest concern there. So here's Charlie Walker again on his second flight as a paying passenger. And you're looking to the west, and they had a cutout. So I forgot to ask Charlie about that, but that's one of the first cutouts of the program. Very scary when that happens. They didn't ever have a disaster out of that because they have a lot of ways to cool the engines down and make sure the fuel doesn't explode, but it's always a possibility. That would scare the... I'll tell you why later, why that would really scare me to death. It's because once that thing lights up, for that 10 seconds, you're starting to have a lot of pitching on the shuttle. So you're going north and south when you're in the cockpit, and when that thing finally hits T0 and takes off, there's no shutting those SRBs down. But they had I think it was a 2% chance of catastrophes what they programmed, and that's based on any of 100 critical components failing during a mission, and they always thought it would be more likely on landing than on launch. Believe it or not. Boy, were they wrong about that. But they always talked about the possibility of a nose wheel not coming out, or main gear door opening during a reentry, something like that. But that never happened. But other things, as we know now, did happen. So here's Charlie Walker going out on his 28.5 degree climb. Just really a great guy to talk to. You can start to see some of the camera angles that become famous when Challengers lost not very long after this. One thing you can't see in the earlier pictures, but it still did happen, was that the for some reason at supersonic speeds, there was a vacuum that pulled the thrust in the exhaust up into the back end of the ET. So, in all the film you see of the ET after separation, about 65 miles or so high, you can always see, you can see a little bit of it there when that vacuum is created and it pulls the flame up into the ET. It never got hot enough to burn through, but I'll tell you what, that would kind of bother me if I drop those things and you start seeing all the scorch marks on the back end of the ET. Well, that's what happened is at supersonic speeds, you just pull the flame right up into that back end of the ET. And I don't think that the computers back then had predicted that, but they kept flying it. I always wanted to know, by then all the ejection seats were pulled out. I've always wanted to ask if there was had an inside joke among the astronauts on the shuttle, on the launch pad, some kind of a prank call, negative seats. And here he is coming back into Kennedy. I can already tell you by the, well, that could be Edwards actually. It could be Edwards. You see a lot more humidity in Florida, so anytime you see the trails like that, it's usually going to be Kennedy. We'll see here in a second. I'm going to probably guess it's going to be Edwards runway 4. Or maybe 22. Or if you start seeing a lot of dust, it's going to be 17. It's been months since I've actually heard the audio of these missions, so all this is basically recollection at this point. I will have audio back in the next segment from the original production. And as you can see, they dive bomb the runway, then they pull the nose up for a flare, lower the landing gear, and put her down. Yep, it's going to be Edwards, and I'm going to say right before sunrise, and I'm going to say it's going to be coming in on runway 4, it looks like, or runway 22. That's probably going to be 22, based on where the sunlight's coming from. Well, let's just correct that all and say that's going to be the lake bed landing, just like the lifting bodies. The next 15, that's going to be runway. I think it was 17, so one they used for that one. It'll actually cross over 4 and 22 at some point. Very beautiful. Alright, here's Colonel Bow going back up on Discovery. If this is not the first flight, it's one of the first, and he's also going up with Charlie Gibson. So it's another reunion crew. And yeah, I'm almost positive this is the first flight of Discovery. Atlantis is yet to come. And Dr. Ray was also on this one, so this is interesting. They did fly together in space. I did not know that. I don't think they ever did it twice, but at some point they got married, so good for them. And here they are doing their normal routine. That astronaut building is actually quite a few miles away from the launch pad. And we have liftoff, Space Shuttle Discovery. And anytime you see Dr. Ray go up, it's normally with a space hab aboard. So that's very interesting. Sometimes they have wind issues on launch, but that thing just takes off so fast that it always clears the tower. In the early days, in the Apollo tradition, they would always say, cleared the tower like they would in the early days, but they developed their own little routine for the shuttle and started to get away from some of the Apollo traditions. And this one here, as you can tell, is on a very, very cloudy day. And once in space, I don't see the space hab. I'm not saying it's not there, but they do launch satellites as they always do. And those things will actually, if everything goes well, once they get clear enough from the shuttle, they'll light their own second stage boosters, and I guess it'd be third stage at this point, and they'd go up to geosynchronous orbit. Dr. Ray, that's when they do the ohms burns like that, it'll put out about, I think it's 1/16 of a G, but that's still enough to move you around and wake you up. Hit your head in your bunk if you're sleeping. There's Jake gone there, so I apologize. This was the flight the senator from Utah was on. But you always wonder what his actual skills, other than being on the SciTech committee in the Senate, what his actual skills are to be an astronaut. But he will demonstrate that shortly for us. And I was talking to Dr. Ray when I saw her about this ultrasound that they did on the heart, and I said when I had cancer last year, this invention had become a NASA spinoff into widespread use in American hospitals, and what a very cool thing that was to actually watch the Doppler radar of your heart in action. You can see the blood flowing, and at different speeds mean different colors. Just wonderful. So it was very cool talking to her. I really appreciate the chance to tell her in person how much I appreciate these inventions that she developed as part of the space program. One of the coolest NASA spin-offs yet. There's Charlie. Just what a great guy. I'm not seeing Space Hab yet, though, so I think that's all being done in the shuttle middeck. But I could be wrong. I really do appreciate all the astronauts who have seen this before Spacefest, and we talked about some errors that need corrected, and I will certainly do that in all these segments as I put the DVD version out. And even then, as time goes on, since I've seen these the audio version of these, I don't claim that my memory is going to still be perfect. Interesting things happen in 0G to instruments that have gyros inside of them. This is an example of that. I don't mean to sound critical of Glenn or Garn or any of these politicians that get themselves into space, but it just it does get worse over time. I'll talk about that later. Dr. Ray. She's just so much fun to be around. And here's how Senator Garn got himself on the shuttle, demonstrating his astute aerodynamic skills. I'm still thinking Space Hab's not on this one. This all looks like the mid deck, so that would be the whole crew would be in the mid deck area. Once again, a lot of medical science was done by Dr. Ray up there. I think I talked about this earlier, but they actually had 100% oxygen in those suits in the hatch, and they were just sitting in there together before they went out while they adjusted the air pressure to something that the suits can handle easier out in the vacuum of space. So believe it or not, the atmosphere in the shuttle itself was pretty close to being the atmosphere on the ground. So they that other the suits would be so overpressurized going out that it'd be hard to move your fingers and stuff. So they had to lower the air pressure in the suits as opposed to inside the cabin for spacewalks. It just made it much easier for the astronauts to move their arms and legs around and not fight the inflation of the suit. And there's Dr. Ray in the rear end of the flight area, looking up to the astronauts out there and working with the robot arm. And I remember this very well from when it first happened. They had this problem on one of their satellites where they all they had to do is flip a switch to turn the power on, and somehow somebody let the thing launch without flipping the switch on the ground. And so she invented this fly swatter that she attempted, I don't think successfully, maybe so, but she attempted to use that fly swatter to activate the power switch. We just flipped the switch on the side of that thing as it turned. So as the switch would go by, the fly swatter would snag it and flip it. I don't know if that was successful or not, but it was an ingenious thought to try. And this would be the shuttle coming back on a right-hand turn, which, if it's Kennedy, will take you up to runway 15. That's probably what's happening here. It looks like a Florida morning to me. And anytime it turned to the left, it would land on 33. Anytime it turned to the right, out of the hack, it would land on 15. And that's from either an ascending or descending node. Ascending means you're coming up over Australia, South America, and the southwestern part of Florida. And the descending node will bring you in over the United States. But still, once you get down to 50,000 feet, the approaches are very similar at either landing site. Just a matter of making the turn to the runway and then lining up for the nosedive to the hack. And yeah, it's going to be 15. Did I say 15? I'm gonna. They turn to the right, so that's gonna be 33. I think I told you backwards. Yeah, that's runway 33. I think this is the one where she blew the tire. She didn't blow the tire, but very, very interesting landing. The tire made it all the way till they stopped. Thank God. I think they double up on the tires, as you can see. So if they lose one, they're okay. If they lose two, then they got an issue. They got a big issue. Yep, there it goes. Maybe he had one more. Beautiful launch with the beautiful landing on runway 17 on the dusty lake bed at Edwards. Once again, what a great guy this guy is. Started out on the same lake bed with the X-15, and really looking forward to meeting him. These were all in the blue suit days, so they were in suits that were suited well with the cockpit and the controls. Not so much for the bulky orange suits. I think they got kind of fat-fingered with those. And once again, one of the people that is going to be here, Charlie Baker, actually played a big role in all the landings out here at Edwards. Next up is STS-21, and it's going to be with Colonel Bo with another reunion crew. This one also was the first flight, I think, of Jerry Ross, Colonel United States Air Force. So you had a colonel crew up here of Air Force colonels. And this is a beautiful, beautiful night launch with a full moon in the background. Kind of reminds me of one I filmed of Endeavour later on in the, I think it was early 2000s. Here they go out to the pad from the astronaut quarters. Not much has changed since the Apollo days as far as how that goes. Just a beautiful sight here. But I filmed a video after I saw Endeavour do this. They were heading on a different path up the coastline. So the title of that was Endeavour Jumped the Moon, like a cow jumps over the moon. This one was on the 28.5, so they took off to the southeast. One thing that the camera always misses that I'll be talking about it probably every time I see this for the night launches. You just kind of see like an orange reddish trail after the boosters separate from what's left of the very, very small chamber thrust coming out of the back of the shuttle boosters. But in real life, you see a lot of greens and blues that don't show up on the camera, but it's just wonderful, and I wish there was some technology then or now to really show you what that really looks like when this happens right there. We pick up the orange pretty easily, but there's a lot more colors going on there. And here they are in a pretty high orbit. Jerry Ross is, there's the colonel. Jerry Ross is what I call Mr. Mission Specialist Spaceman, because almost everything he does in space, as well as Story Musgrave and a couple others, have really big emphasis on spacewalks. I think there was only one mission where Jerry Ross went up that didn't have a spacewalk involved. And this was his first of 7, so you'll be seeing a lot of him, hopefully at Spacefest, and a lot of him here in these videos. And I think 7 missions up to space is what he finally ended up with, and that's an awful lot. There's another one of those Ohms burns. Here they are in the mid-deck once again. I sure miss those days when you saw the flags everywhere. It's Jerry hiding up in the corner. And as predicted, spacewalk for something called Access. And this is a tower that they had built. They were just testing construction methods in space. Some of these towers actually had a radar connected to them, and I know one that had a Martian eye evidence on the flight actually discovered oil in places where we had never seen it, using technologies available only from space. This spacewalk was a little bit dangerous, it looked like, because you don't see the tethers you see on most other flights. I don't know how they got up there, except for maybe just hanging on to the poles, but they'll go up to the top of these and try to connect them. Jerry Ross was probably the best cinematographer of the program as far as what
NASA released and let out there. So he was a really good photographer, so capturing stuff that everybody else saw, but somehow didn't film, or like I said, maybe it just wasn't released. But here they are in the old suits, getting ready to come back. They were much more comfortable, but after the loss of Columbia, they decided to go with a different program. There's the plasma trail coming back in, and they're going to do another great landing on Edwards runway 22, which is concrete. Next up, we're going to see a new shuttle, the newer shuttle, Discovery. Another spectacular night launch with another reunion crew. Charlie Gibson will go up with, not Charlie Gibson, Hoot Gibson will go up with Charlie Walker. Rod Navy. This is actually my favorite kind of launch, is when it's dark on the ground, but there's already a sunset already happened, or a sunrise is still pending. And in this case, the sunrise is pending, but you see exactly what you see from the ground. One of my best videos of this experience was STS-119. They'll climb into the sunset, so you'll start seeing that trail become yellow and then red and then sheer white. It's not really white, it's more of a powder gray, but sure looks beautiful. And you can see this from almost anywhere in Florida when it happens. At higher altitudes, after this happens and they separate the boosters, you can still see the shuttle, because they'll usually light up a ohms burn, and that will create a huge spray behind the shuttle as it goes into space. It's very visible. There's Charlie. And this would have to be the last launch we're going to have of this crew in the blue suits before the loss of Challenger. So the last we're going to see of the blue suits, and the last we're going to see of the shuttle for a couple years. Charlie's specialty was systems and development for the payload bay, so for 24 of 135 launches, I was a huge fan of the shuttle program. At an average of about once every 2.5 months, NASA put Columbia, Challenger, and Discovery to space again and again, and brought the crews home safely from what was becoming a routine access to low Earth orbit.
And liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
And then came Flight 25.
Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles. throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Challenger, go with throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
After Challenger's loss, it was clear to my DoD and many commercial customers that the shuttle could no longer be trusted as a viable launch option. Left with few remaining partners, NASA chose not to ground the inherently dangerous shuttle design. Orange pressure suits that were never designed for the cockpit controls became NASA's solution. SRBs were redesigned, and an escape pole that required unlikely flight conditions to work was installed. Deck chairs were shuffled on the Titanic of the space program.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation.
Mainly from political pressures related to congressional pork, the shuttle was not grounded and the money was never diverted to develop a better design. From the beginning, NASA had projected a 2% catastrophe rate based on the metrics predicting a failure in any of 100 critical components necessary for takeoff or landing. No serious effort was ever made to improve the odds of the flawed design. That would require changes to cost and mass that were beyond the limits of the existing program as designed and appropriated. Political and economic pressures led NASA to keep the shuttle, and those such as me who endorsed grounding the program to free up funds to develop a safe alternative were ignored. In the next 25 years, NASA was no longer the innovator, but simply the protector and maintainer of the status quo. By the end, Principal Ness retired the 1972 design, and 40 years later, with no one to blame but itself, that its successor was not ready to fly. I have a whole lot of good things to say, and quite a few bad actually to say about KSC, but almost nothing but criticism for NASA's chosen vendor to run the visitor center there, Delaware North. I'll save that story for another day. All fueled up with nowhere to go on most flights, NASA attempted to revitalize the program by answering the question, shuttle to where? Most remaining flights in the program served to launch and assemble an international station in space, ISS, or ISS as it's more commonly called. After Columbia was lost, justification was again found to keep the flawed shuttle in operation by meeting international commitments to get the rest of the modules up there at any cost. The follow-on program, the Ares Orion constellation, was fatal in designing cost, or as we say here on Earth, DOA. The ISS